My name's Dale Roberts. I work at the University of Western Australia at Albany, and this talk is about frogs and climate change, and it reflects my historical interest in biogeography and speciation and a concern about what might happen in the future, but also a 40-year history of living through climate variation in Australia. I've got three questions that I want to talk about. One is, how fast can frogs evolve? And some of that can be very rapid, and some of it may not take millennia or hundreds of thousands of years. Secondly, I want to talk about, are frogs adapted to local climate variation? And the answer to that is yes. And I want to talk about south coast frogs in Western Australia and southwestern Australia because they've lived through multi-millions of years of climate variation and directional climate change, and I want to speculate about whether frogs might be able to cope with future climate variation and directional climate change. First thing I want to talk about is studies on tree frogs in alpine areas in eastern Australia. Latoria veroi alpina, that's a green tree frog, green and brown, and it was studied in the 50s and 60s by Murray Littlejohn from Melbourne University, and he did lots of recordings of Latoria veroi because he was interested in call variation and how they interacted with other species. So there is a historical, very detailed map of distributions of that species, which also allows us to study an incredible amount of decline. It was studied by a student at the Australian National University, Ben Shield, and then he's gone back and looked at these populations which apparently had disappeared and discovered that there were some persistent populations and populations had recovered. And so there was now the beginnings of recovery from a decline which appeared to be caused by the thing called Kittredge fungus, which causes a disease called Kittredioidomycosis, which is a global phenomenon which has caused extinctions and declines in frogs in all parts of the world. If we look at what's happened in recovering populations, and we look at historical data on the ages of frogs, which you can get from growth rings in the toe bones, like you can get growth rings in trees and estimate ages of trees because the growth rings are annual, then historically populations had frogs up to 6 years old. They were living for several years and probably breeding several times in their lifetime. If you look at populations that are recovering, they're currently reproducing at 1 but mostly 2 years old. But the survival rates for those adults that are breeding is very, very low. It's about 4%. And so there's been a radical shift from old frogs breeding and to young frogs breeding, and that's related to the impact of Kittredge fungus. What's happened is that frogs are now leaving the frog without a Kittredge infection. They metamorphose, they leave the pond, they go away for about 18 months and they come back to breed at 1 or mostly 2 years old. They breed, they get Kittredge infection, and then they probably die. So we've got a radical shift in life history structure which is associated with the impact of Kittredge fungus. It's very similar to the sort of pattern you see in fisheries biology, where overexploitation of the fishery stock gets rid of all the big old adults who've been around breeding for years, and you're left with young, early maturing breeders, which is what's left in the population. But it's a radical shift. But the population has adapted to a selection pressure imposed by Kittredge fungus, a very powerful and very rapidly acting selection pressure. Second study I want to talk about is a small frog, Crinia, which are little froglets that occur in many places in Australia under different names. This is a study of a frog that occurs from the far southwestern Australia right out to the edge of the desert and the edge of the wheat belt. The northeastern wheat belt, it primarily breeds in pools on granite outcrops, which are pretty hot and temporary. And in the southwest it's breeding drains along the side of roads, in swamps and so on. It's a shallow water species. It's not breeding in deep rivers or anything along those lots of lines. But again, you can look at growth rings in the toe bones and you can see variability in age structure across the wheat belt. And you see a number of things that come out of those data. First of all, in hot and dry areas frogs tend to be older and to live longer, and in relatively cool areas in the southwest their investment in first reproduction, which is reflected in the distance between these growth rings in the toes, is comparatively high, and in the wheat belt they're spreading their investment out. In other words, you go to drier environments, and that fits with standard life history theory, which suggests that in a predictable environment where there's good resources, you might put all your eggs into one basket and breed once because your offspring will survive and things will do well. On the edge of the wheat belt, where your pond might dry out very quickly, you hang on and have another go the next year and the next year and the next year, or the next time it rains or the next time it rains, and so you're actually spreading your reproduction out over a longer period but with less predictability about survival of the eggs you're producing and the tadpoles that are coming through and so on. Why is it important to think about that? Then we tend to think about future predictions of climate change, directional climate change caused by global warming, as being the end of the world or something approaching that. There's something that we can't control, but we forget that climates are variable. I'm old enough to have lived through 2 major floods, for example, on the River Murray and the Murray-Darling system in Eastern Australia, and one of those is when I was doing my PhD, so it was very fresh in my mind, of extremely heavy rainfall. It's 5 inches of rain in an afternoon at Blanchetown in South Australia when I first started working in that part of the world. But if we look at some recent reconstructions of climate history from Eastern Australia and from Southwestern Australia, we see the same sort of thing. They're based on tree growth rings, and tree growth rings vary depending on the width between rings varies depending on the amount of rainfall that's been around, and so you can calibrate known history of rainfall with known history of climate of tree ring variation to calibrate the variability in rainfall. And you can then project backwards might have a 500-year history in tree rings for an old tree, and what the climate was in the past. And that's been done in southwestern Australia, where you've got data from near Esperance in the southeastern wheat belt. And what you can see if you look at this plot is there's extreme variability between years. There are periods where rainfall is very low, periods where rainfall is very high. And if you look at the black line on the slide, there's a smooth sort of average running through it. But you can see some periods of very high rainfall in the 1970s, a hump again and a bit after that, and low rainfall currently, but periods of high and low rainfall going back historically. And similar data sets have been generated for Eastern Australia now, which are quite powerful global models which show that there is a long history of rainfall variability, and it's not unusual for a period of an extended period of drought like there was in the Millennium Drought in Eastern Australia, nor is it unusual to have periods of relatively high rainfall over extended periods, but also extreme variability between years. And just as an example, there's this rainfall in 2010 and 2011. Enormous amounts of rain over inland Australia and Eastern Australia. Southwestern Australia was relatively dry during that period in contrast, and that reflects the nature of the climate drivers from El Nino and La Nina events in the Pacific to things occurring in the Indian Ocean and north of the Indian Ocean coming down from Indonesia and so on. It's a complex driver of what's going on with climate. But we need to appreciate there are periods of high rainfall and there are periods of low rainfall, and you might expect, for looking at frogs for example, that high rainfall will be years when frogs do well, probably generally true, and very low years of low rainfall will be years when frogs generally broadly do badly. So populations of frogs will go up and down, and part of the driver of that will be events like long-term climate variation. If we look at southwestern Australia and think about what's going, we tend to think of southwestern Australia as an area with a Mediterranean climate, high rainfall in winter and hot dry summers. But that is part of the perception, and if you go to the wheat belt in Western Australia, east of Perth, that's exactly the sort of pattern you see. If you go to the south coast of Western Australia, from Augusta through to roughly Albany, then you also are looking at areas that are still relatively wet during summer. And there are a number of species that occurs in those areas that are retained the pattern of breeding, of spring into summer breeding, which is also characteristic of frogs along much of the east coast and in tropical Australia, reflecting probably their very long history going back to the Miocene, when most of Australia was in rainforest or relatively wet forests and relatively warm, and then as Australia moved further north, then the continent started to dry out. So if we look at Spicospina, the sunset frog, which occurs in areas from roughly Walpole through to northeast of Walpole on the south coast, then it's a spring and summer breeder. Whereas other frogs that occur in that area are classical Mediterranean climate autumn breeders, autumn into winter breeders. How long has a sunset frog been there? Sunset frog has been there in a tree that we've developed for probably of the order of 20 or 30 million years. And you go, how can that be? It's related to a genus of frogs called Eupraleas. Eupraleas occur along the east coast and across northern Australia, and they're the most diverse frog genus in the country. At the time that we described Spicospina, we didn't appreciate the similarity to Eupraleas, but it's pretty old and quite different in sorts of ways. But Spicospina is functionally a Eupralea. It's nearly 30 million years old. Why has it been stuck here? That's the way the climate varied. The Nullarbor Plain was a major barrier to frog dispersal into southwestern Australia. The Nullarbor Plain was formed by 3 major marine incursions going back, I think, 25 million years, but finishing perhaps about 14 million years ago. The dates might be a bit fuzzy, I can't remember them exactly. But sunset frogs have been in southwestern Australia for a very, very long time. And that's true of a large number of frog genera in Western Australia. Early work that I did on east-west divergent states put things back, way back before the Pleistocene, which was the conventional wisdom at that time. And these frog lineages are multi-million years old in southwestern Australia, and the sunset frog is a classic example of that. If we look at Geochronia rosea, these are complex. There are 4 species. Geochronia alba, the white-bellied frog, occurs between Margaret River and Augusta. Geochronia vitellina, the orange-bellied frog, that occurs in a single creek system on the north side of the Blackwood River. Geochronia rosea, which occurs along the Warren River drainages and the Shannon River drainages, the Shannon and Garden River drainages in the southwest. And then Geochronia lutea, which occurs within Deep River and Franklin River drainages near Walpole. 4 species. Again, they're spring into summer breeders. They have direct developing eggs, so they lay their eggs in a little hollow in the ground. The eggs hatch out and you have a tadpole sitting in a soup. It doesn't feed, it relies exclusively on yolk in the gut to get by. And again, these are ancient lineages. They're related to other Geochronia species both in southwestern Australia and southeastern Australia, which have completely different breeding biologies. Geochronia lei, for example, occurs in southwestern Australia, and it's a conventional autumn into winter breeder. But again, these frogs are old, 8 million years between orange-bellied and white-bellied frogs, which are separated by a distance of 8 kilometres. They haven't managed to go across that gap. The environment has dried out, and it's not compatible with the persistence of those frogs. Geochronia rosea and lutea are probably a similar age of divergence. The splits between rosea and lutea and alba and vitellina are around 40 million years. These are very old lineages which have survived from rainforest and similar hot, steamy environments back in the early Miocene 20 million years ago. If you look at climate variation, this is roughly a distribution of vegetation in Australia at 23 million years in the Oligocene-Miocene boundary. Rainforest over much of eastern Australia and much of inland Australia as well, drying out a little bit on the west coast, but also a rainforest and wet eucalypt forests and similar sorts of forests in southwestern Australia. So that's where these old lineages have come from, and they've hung on in either patches of forest that have retained enough of the characteristics that they evolved in to persist, or they may have moved around the landscape and actually been capable of selecting microhabitats that suited their particular breeding biology that have persisted in those sorts of areas. I think one of the things we need to think about is retain a very clear understanding of this historical perspective. Frogs have done a lot of stuff. They've survived. They've lived through radical climate change. They've lived through the abuses of clearing in the wheat belt in Western Australia, of secondary salinity caused by that process, of logging in the forest system, and so on. And maybe frogs can cope with the future better than we can do anything for them. Because if we look at our attempts, for example, to relocate frogs in translocation exercises, they've generally been very unsuccessful. So there's not much we can probably do except have faith in the frog fauna and its demonstrated capacity to adapt to changing climates over very long periods of time, and to adjust their biology and their breeding biology and their life history characteristics to cope with those strong new selection pressures. That's it.